Good morning. I'm Carlos Lozada of the Washington Post. It is my pleasure to have Cardinal Donald Wuerl, Archbishop of Washington, on the stage with us. We're so pleased you could take time out of your schedule, which must be very busy right now, to talk to us before your boss gets to town. So Cardinal Wuerl was elevated to the College of Cardinals by Pope Benedict XVI in 2010. He serves on the Vatican Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith and as Chancellor of the Catholic University of America, of which he is a graduate, local boy, and as Chairman of the Pope John Paul II Cultural Foundation. He was ordained bishop by John Paul II in 1986. I encourage folks in the audience and those following us online to tweet your questions and comments to us, #PopeVisit. It'll be a popular hashtag in the coming days. We also have cards on your chairs. Please write down your questions. They'll be collected, and my colleague Sarah Polian-Bailey, one of our terrific religion reporters here at the Post, will sift through them and pose your questions at the end. Cardinal Wuerl, you were part of the conclave that elected Pope Francis a couple of years ago. We understand you're close to the Pope. Despite the glut of coverage we've had, what would you say is the most important thing that we don't know about Pope Francis or that we misunderstand about him?
Well, Carlos, I think the way the Holy Father is presented, I think is a very, very fair reflection of who he is. It's hard to see a difference between the person that we know, and the way he comes across in public, this public persona. They're identical. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with the authenticity of the person. That's the one quality that I would highlight. He has a transparency to him that comes across, so that if it's in the midst of 30,000 people in St. Peter's Square as he's riding around in the Pope Mobile, it can be manifested as simply as asking them to stop so that he can reach out and hug somebody. I'm sure it gives his security detail all kind of palpitations when he decides to jump out of the Pope Mobile and hug somebody. But that same style is what you see when you go and visit him one-on-one. It's a very authentic, human, and at the same time, spiritual style.
Did you anticipate this sort of reaction in the conclave when you were electing the Pope?
I think going into the conclave, the one thing that I suspect, and this comes out of the week-long meetings we had beforehand, all the cardinals gathered, and it was an opportunity for us to spend a week together talking, listening to one another, and we kept hearing, we really need to reform, to shake up the structures. It's becoming fairly rigid, and that had to do with the operational structures. It had to do with some of the ways in which the curial offices carried out their work. And this Holy Father was very, very open in saying, we do need to take a look at this and move things along. So in that sense, I don't think anybody was surprised. What was surprising, I think, was when they asked him, what name do you take? And he said, Francis. And I think there was then an audible, not gasp, but awareness that this was different. And then he explained afterwards, he chose the name because Francis was the Pope of the poor. And he told us afterwards something that I thought was very beautiful. He said, when it was clear, when the votes went over the amount needed to win, he told us afterwards that the cardinal next to him said to him, don't forget the poor.
There's been so much talk of the Francis effect, right? The notion that through his personality and his celebrity to some extent, that this pope would re-energize the faithful and bring Catholics back to the pews. A recent Washington Post ABC News poll found that American Catholics overwhelmingly respond positively to this pope, adore Pope Francis, but we're not necessarily seeing a lot of evidence that of a big boost in identification with the church or even attendance at Mass. Is this, how do you interpret this? Are we seeing sort of the limits of the Francis effect?
Carlos, I think the Francis effect is twofold. It's something that's very evident by the way people respond to him, but there's something more subtle. And I'm seeing that with many, many of our young adults. From my perspective, the group that is being most strongly impacted by him are those young adults in the 20s and early 30s who are finding in him an answer to many of their questions. I think we are seeing a generation now that is not altogether convinced that the responses of the 70s and 80s really are the full story of what it means to be a full human being. And many of them are looking for that spiritual dimension, that transcendental reference point in their life, God. And they're finding it in Francis in this very authentic way. He doesn't project a religious structure. He projects a spiritual relationship with God. And I think that's what many, many are finding so attractive. I don't think right now you could take a poll and be able to measure that. It's going to be something long-term, and probably it's going to be manifested in a renewal. We're already seeing that, though. The number of young people responding. Last Easter, in this archdiocese alone, we received 1,300 people into the church, and more than half of them were in this young category I'm talking about.
Here at St. Matthew's?
Yes. Well, it's across the whole archdiocese.
Right, but yeah.
But yes, at St. Matthew's, of course, because that's where I do the receiving.
Now, there are some who have responded more critically to the Pope's, what would appear to be the Pope's more sort of progressive views, whether it's on the environment or divorced Catholics or homosexuality. What do you say to those who kind of like their popes more traditional?
Yeah. One of the things that I find so inviting, again, about Pope Francis, he hasn't spoken against any of the great traditions of the church, nor would you expect him to. He's Pope. His job is to see that great tradition is passed on. But he does it in a way that doesn't emphasize the negative aspect of it. For example, he keeps saying there's room for everybody in church. There's room for everybody. And you don't have to be perfect to come to church. Remember that interview he did with America Magazine when they asked him to identify himself, and he said, I'm a sinner, but I'm a sinner who's been embraced by the love of God. And I think where people are finding him attractive is he keeps saying, go out and meet people where they are, encounter them where they are. And he doesn't say then scold them. He said, when you encounter them, then begin to accompany them. And maybe both of you will get closer to God. And I think that's what is so attractive, but it's also part of the great balance he brings to things. He proclaims the faith. Listen to his talks. He proclaims the creed very, very clearly. But he does it in a way that says there's room for all of us.
Pope Francis famously answered, who am I to judge, when asked about welcoming gay Catholics into the church. what do you think the long-term impact of that statement and of Francis's views on homosexuality will be and will mean, especially for the American church, when we've had the Supreme Court ruling on same-sex marriage and government requirements of health care for same-sex partners?
I think one of the things we want to be very clear in understanding what Pope Francis said and what the church has always said and where the church is. The welcoming of every human being is a part of the tradition, the great tradition of the church. We go out to welcome everyone. We encounter every human being with respect, but between a person and what a person does, there's a great deal of difference. And that's where I think we always will find there is going to be some abrasion. People will feel that when the church also proclaims that there is a moral order, that there is a purpose to marriage, that there is a right and a wrong. And the church will always continue to proclaim that while respecting every person and saying there should be room for and is room for everybody. But at the same time, not everything everybody does can be blessed.
You've referred to some of the more conservative critics of Pope Francis as dissenters, I believe. And at the same time, you have been something of a dissenter yourself, for instance, when you refused to deny Holy Communion to politicians who supported abortion rights. How much room is there for sort of healthy disagreement or dissent within the church?
Well, the word I used was disagreement. The report on it said dissent, but the word I used was disagreement. And
the press.
But there's always been some disagreement about something in the church. You can't have an institution with 1,300,000,000 people and not have some disagreements. Some of them are more substantial than others. I think it's a very healthy thing, and we're seeing this in the synod gatherings, these gatherings of bishops from all over the world that the Pope has one, and we're having a second one in October, where he says to us, when you come together as church leadership, speak with clarity, listen with humility, and be open to the Holy Spirit. And I think that's the posture that the church and church leadership should have, and that's what he's inviting us into. And as soon as that happens, you're going to hear differing views, not on the core of the faith, not on the bedrock of the faith. In fact, one of the things Carlos, I found so impressive at one of the synods, this was a number of years ago, on the Eucharist, which is the core sacrament of the Catholic Church. There were 220 of us in this synod aula. We were there for 3 weeks. At the end of the first day, it was clear there's nobody in that room who doesn't share the same faith about what the Eucharist is. The rest of the time was to talk about how do you pastorally care for a flock that has to know and learn and appreciate what Eucharist is. And I think that's what the Pope is experiencing with all of us today, and what the church is experiencing. This disagreement on issues is not about what do we believe, but how do we live that out in the world in which we live. You know, it's a very challenging world. Trying to be a Christian today in a highly secular environment or in a hostile environment brings its own challenges.
Do you feel the American church, do you feel the church in Washington faces that hostile environment?
I think we're as a culture, there's an aspect of the American culture that's very secular. Now, I don't mean the difference between clerical and secular, between separation of church and state. I mean by secular, that mindset, that philosophical or ideological position that says there is no transcendent reference point, that it's all here, And then there's the other, and I think this is a more pernicious side to that says, and the secular view should be the only view in the marketplace. It should be the only view heard in the community, in society. And for people of faith, for people who have values, deep values that go all the way back to the founding of our country and beyond, you really can't have a culture that doesn't recognize those faith-based values, an orientation that recognizes God, in God we trust, and to say that with sincerity. So I think that's the challenge that many Christians, that the church faces in our country, the idea that somehow your religion should be kept inside the sanctuary, but don't bring it out into the public forum. Don't bring it out into the common discussion of the life of the country. That's not unusual. We hear that fairly regularly.
Pope Francis's popularity and personality and celebrity have taken, at least temporarily, some of the focus off the clergy abuse scandal inside the Catholic Church. What is the Pope doing in this regard, on this matter, that is different from Pope Benedict? Beyond sort of outreach to victims, what is he doing in terms of accountability for the bishops under whose watch this happened?
Yeah. Remember now, when we speak of the clergy sex abuse, we're talking about something that took place a long time ago, that it's been nearly 14 years since the Catholic Church in this country has put into place draconian measures to see that, first of all, anyone who has been abused receives attention and care and becomes the focus of the Church's ministry, and that any priest who has done this is removed. So we sometimes hear, and I sometimes get the impression when I hear this debate today, that it's going on today. We're talking about something that took place years ago. And the Catholic Church responded in a very strong way with programs now. Even our volunteers have to go through a screening. We have all kinds of background checks. And our programs for our young people in our schools are primarily to see that they're very, very aware of anything that would be incorrect that they would experience so that they can report that. So I think we have to look at where we are today and see it in the light of all the progress that's been made over nearly 14 years since that crisis took place. Do we have a long way to go? I think there's always going to be a long way to go. I would hope that some of our public institutions, schools, and other public entities might want to adopt some of the zero tolerance and some of the practices that the Church has developed over these years to protect children. What happens in terms of accountability, I think this Holy Father has said, establishing this commission at the highest level in the Church to see there is a way now to address if a bishop fails to carry out his responsibilities. I think that's been an improvement, just as the changes that took place in church law 14 years ago were an improvement to let bishops act much more quickly in removing a priest.
Pope Francis is meeting with the U.S. bishops this week. Last Christmas, he delivered a pretty stern message to the Roman Curia, to the Vatican bureaucracy, suggesting they were not acting in an attitude of service and sort of as lords of the manor instead. What do you think his message is going to be to the U.S. bishops? And how do you think the U.S. bishops have the same priorities? The priorities are in line with those of Francis?
Carlos, I think when the Holy Father speaks, and I took that talk that he gave to the Curia with those points, I took that and used it as my own personal meditation for a couple of days, because it is something he was calling all of us, and he said he applied it to himself. We have to ask ourselves regularly, when we're serving others. How well am I doing this? Am I doing it for them? Am I careful that I am not inserting myself first in my priorities? Those are very, very good questions that I think every one of us should from time to time ask ourselves. How faithful am I to my claim that I really do care for others, that I put others first? That was part of what he was saying, and I think that's a very good thing for all of us to reflect on. The challenge today for every pastor of soul, certainly every bishop, is how do you announce the gospel, live the gospel, and at the same time be responsible for a huge structural, institutional reality. I would love to be able to walk to work instead of having a car and drive to work. But I would probably lose a lot of the time that I use in the office working with the people who run Catholic Charities, run our schools, run healthcare services, run social services, and still be available to the people in our parishes. So sometimes you have to find a balance, but I don't think you can measure the attitude of a person by necessarily the externals. And I think our Holy Father also reminds us of that too.
In Laudato Si, the environmental encyclical, Pope Francis spoke of wrote of the grave implications of climate change and decried the huge consumption of rich countries and the detrimental impact this had on the developing world. Clearly he was referring to the United States, and as the Archbishop of Washington, where a lot of the decisions and debates on this subject take place, how do you see his message message on the environment resonating with the political leadership here?
I think that's a very, very significant question that's going to come up during his visit here. One of the things that we often are told, if the shoe fits, wear it. If we hear, when the Pope talks about a throwaway culture, if the Pope talks about a culture that wastes more than it should, of a culture that doesn't respect the quality and dignity of life, maybe we feel that's being directed specifically to us because we look around and we see some of those realities here. The thing I liked about Laudato Si, and that marvelous encyclical, is the Pope starts with empirical facts. He talks about the harm that's being done to this planet. I can remember for years hearing about the destruction of the rainforest in the Amazon, about the quality of water around the planet being diminished, now even the amount of it. So it's not as if all of this is new, but what he's saying is cumulatively, the damage being done to this planet is something you can quantify. What he does in the encyclical, though, is to take that data and say, the very opening section says, why don't we all sit around the table, figuratively? Why don't we all sit around the table and talk about how we're going to deal with these problems? He doesn't say, I have the solutions, let me tell you what to do. He says, shouldn't we all be working at resolving these problems? Because the planet is a limited reality, and we want to make sure there is sustainable growth well into the future. He uses something of a frame of reference throughout the encyclical. He says, start with these facts and you realize we have problems. We all need to come together and start to resolve them. The frame of reference for resolving them includes, at the center is the human person. And we have to respect and foster the dignity and the flourishing of the human person. Secondly, we have to see that in doing that, we also care for our common home, the earth. And thirdly, he says, whatever development is going to take place, and it's necessary that there be economic and social development, it has to be sustainable. It has to be done in a way that 2 generations from now, they'll still be able to enjoy the goods of the earth.
I believe we have some time for audience questions now.
I'm Sarah Pulliam-Bailey with the Washington Post, religion reporter here. Cardinal Wuerl, I have some questions from the audience. As you were just mentioning, Pope Francis has been outspoken on climate change. What specific ways is the Archdiocese, what specific movements have they made to implement the things that he said in the encyclical?
One of the important things that I think we as a culture simply have to begin to address is waste. The throwaway culture that sees it so convenient to use some things and then not feel the need to ever reuse them again, simply to throw them away. I think of the amount of food that gets thrown away at banquets, dinners, events, even the size of the portions in a fast food place. All of that, I think we as a people have to begin to look at. I know in the Archdiocese, we have, with any of the new building going on, we try to be very, very alert that we would be making use of whatever is available today to be green.
Some traditional Catholics are more concerned with Pope Francis's approach. How would you respond to them?
Again, that's a very significant question, because it's hard always to sort out what people are unhappy with. Some I think are unhappy because he doesn't wear what they would call the right clothes. There are others who are unhappy because he seems to be saying things that they find far too open. And sometimes people are unhappy because they're really not paying attention to what he's saying. They're hearing what someone else is saying he's saying. And I think that's probably the most confusing part of it. It's hard to identify what people are upset about, but for the most part, it seems to be less than what's at the core of our faith and tradition.
Do you think he will follow Pope Benedict and resign at some point?
That's a question I'm not going to type.
You could make some news, yeah. I have one final question. The title of this conversation, I believe, is The Francis Effect, and it's easy to speak in very broad terms about what that means. What has the Francis Effect been on you personally? How has this Pope affected your faith, your work, your prayer?
Thank you for raising that, because that's the same question that my spiritual director asks me. How are you making sure that what the Pope is talking about, the effect he's having, is reflected in your own ministry? And I think it causes us to ask. I ask myself, are you staying focused on what is at the soul of the gospel? And are you trying to make sure that you're touching people who need to be touched? Now, for a bishop, that means many times institutionally. I'm not always able to go out and meet every person who has a need, but I can see that our institutions are doing the best they can to be there. And that's something that I take very seriously and weigh in my heart a lot. Are we doing what we can to reach as many people who have needs as possible?
Cardinal Wuerl, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Carlos. Thank you. Thank you.